Why do you think the UN is consistently trying to disarm the public and the nations? They don't want us to be capable of fighting back. The proof of this is in the film released by the UN called Armed to the Teeth, where it demonizes gun ownership. It is also shown in the Freedom from War policy put in place by JFK in 1961.
President John Kennedy went to the United Nations September 1961, and he presented the United States program for general and complete disarmament in a peaceful world during a speech, and he said, this is the official program of the United States of America. It's a disarmament program. It calls for the United States to turn over its military to the United Nations. Now, let that sit for a second. It calls for the United States to turn over its military to the United Nations. The program ends by saying progressive controlled disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. The UN would have all military power.
This policy outlines some pretty scary scenarios when you understand what it reads. It calls for the disbanding of all national armed forces and the prohibition of their reestablishment in any form whatsoever other than those required to preserve internal order and for contributions to a United Nations peace force. This clearly shows that the UN is calling for all military power to be under their control. Inspection and verification must establish both that nations carry out scheduled limitation or reductions and that they do not retain armed forces and armaments in excess of those permitted at any stage of the disarmament process. Strategic delivery vehicles will be reduced. Arms and armed forces will be reduced. And all the while, UN peacekeeping powers would be strengthened. A UN Peace Observation Group would be available to investigate any situation which might constitute a threat to or a breach of the peace. Establishing of a permanent international peace force within the United Nations, and depending on the findings of an experts commission, a halt in the production of chemical, bacteriological, and radiological weapons, and a reduction of the existing stocks or their conversion to peaceful uses. Peaceful uses of biological, chemical, and radiological weapons? Do you see how they are perverting the word peace and making this policy sound unilaterally good? There is no other way to read this publication. It clearly states that all nations will hand over their military forces to a global United Nations military. And along with the film Armed to the Teeth, we have a supposed hero among us called Michael Moore, who released Bowling for Columbine as an attempt to show how tragic accidental gun-related deaths are.
How many people are killed by guns each year? In Germany, 381. In France, 255. In Canada, 165. In the United Kingdom, 68. In Australia, 65. In Japan, 39. In the United States, 11,127.
The United States has a population of approximately 285 million and Australia 19 million. If we were to apply Australia's homicide rate to the US population, that would work out to 5,715 murders. Interestingly enough, Canada, the country Moore portrays as a peaceful land, actually has a higher crime rate than the US based on 2003 statistics. Interpol stats also say the same.
Burn the trees in our path, fill the holes with our past, build our lives around hopes, even when they don't last. We've got nothing to do, find the half that we lost. Please take my loneliness and tell me better only.
Just as he did after the Columbine shooting, Charlton Heston showed up in Flint to have a big pro-gun rally.
Freedom has never seen greater peril. nor needed you more urgently to come to her defense than now.
Before he came to Flint, Heston was interviewed by the Georgetown Hoya about Kayla's death, and even his own NRA website talked about it.
We wanted to let the NRA know that we haven't forgotten about Kayla Rowland. How could they come here? To me, it's like they're rubbing their nose in it. I was shocked and appalled that they would come here.
The idea is to make you believe Heston went to Flint to give a gun rally right after a little girl's murder. This is quite a number of degrees from truth. Kayla Rowland was murdered on February 29, 2000. Heston's speech was given on October 17, 2000. And the event at which Heston gave his speech was not a pro-gun rally, as Moore says. It was a get out the vote campaign rally. It had nothing to do with Kayla's murder. The Georgetown Hoya paper with a reference to Kayla was actually a question to Heston. Heston didn't even respond to that part of the question.
Even his own NRA website talked about it.
And this is even further from the truth. This website is pro-NRA, but it's not Heston's. It does not say Heston gave a speech 48 hours after Kayla Rowland died, because he never did. But the text flashes by so quickly your mind says, Heston did something 48 hours after the murder. If you freeze frame it, you can clearly see Bill Clinton's name. The original text says, 48 hours after Kayla Rowland is pronounced dead, Bill Clinton is on the Today Show telling a sympathetic Katie Couric, maybe this tragic death will help.
I would much rather go for the 1 in a million chance of being killed or injured by an accidental gunshot wound than leave myself completely helpless against any government that wishes to control me. The Second Amendment wasn't put in place by our forefathers to protect us from burglars or trespassers. It was specifically meant to protect us from our government, because Great Britain did not have those rights to bear arms. Michael Moore is what we call a false idol leading a false rebellion. The U.S. population is currently around 300 million. The national debt is currently around 10 trillion. So the current debt, when divvied among the American people, comes out to approximately $33,000 and has been growing at a national rate of $1.46 billion a day since 2006. Now with electronic banking, wire transfers, and credit cards, people have less physical custody of their money. As of right now, the amount of money in circulation is not able to cover the national debt. This was carefully planned since the inception of the Federal Reserve Bank. And the next planned step by the elite is already in play. George Bush signed a bill implementing the North American Union.
President Bush signed a formal agreement that will end the United States as we know it. And he took the step without approval from either the U.S. Congress or the people of the United States.
I think one thing people who are dollar-based need to focus on is the Amero. That's the one thing that nobody's talking about that I think is going to have a big impact on everybody's life in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. The Amero is the proposed new currency for the North American community, which is being developed right now between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico to make a borderless community, much like the EU, and the dollar, Canadian dollar, U.S. dollar, and the Mexican peso replaced by the Amero.
You see, the domination of government by business is called fascism. And I'm kind of wondering how many people know what NAFTA is, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Because under Chapter 11 of the NAFTA agreement, NAFTA tribunals trump all U.S. law if it conflicts with either A, World Bank's International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, or B, UN Commission for International Trade Law. Now, that sounds scary enough, but when you understand what that reads, it also gives the power to violate the First and Second Amendment, which is saying, bye-bye to the Constitution. This will weaken national sovereignty and bankrupt the dollar we use now. After this happens, the Fed will call in all debts. When the debts cannot be repaid by the people, assets will be seized. And by this, I mean absolutely everything you own, including your property, your home, your vehicle, your furniture, and the clothes on your back. This plan is already in progress. And when it takes place, you will literally be owned by the Federal Reserve Bank.